Lena Walvis had just finished a long day in her downtown office, where she worked as an editor for a well-known publishing house. She loved her job, but it often left her exhausted after hours spent poring over manuscripts and editing drafts of authors who barely understood the nuances of storytelling. She had been working on a new project, a novel that would challenge the way society viewed race and identity. And with the final drafts in the hands of her editor, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The drive home was a welcome escape from the office, a chance to clear her mind and let the thoughts settle. It was a peaceful drive through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, the evening sky painted with soft hues of pink and orange as she passed familiar landmarks on her way to the apartment, where she lived alone in a small but cozy space full of books and the echoes of her thoughts on life and the stories that she crafted for a living. Lena loved her neighborhood for its quiet charm and the way the city seemed to slow down the closer she got to home. It was one of those peaceful moments when the world around her felt calm and serene. She couldn't remember the last time she'd driven without feeling the weight of the world pressing in on her, but tonight the music playing softly in the background helped her let go for a moment. It was almost as though the day had never happened, that she could pretend for just a few minutes that she wasn't a writer or an editor, but simply someone driving home from work at the end of a long day. But as she turned a corner and approached an intersection, she saw flashing lights in her rearview mirror. The sudden buzz of sirens pulled her from her peaceful reverie. She blinked in surprise and pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what could have prompted the stop. The officer approached her window with a polite but firm expression. Lena rolled down the window and greeted him with a tired but polite smile. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said in a tone that seemed too formal for such a small violation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Lena glanced at the speedometer before turning back to him. "I'm not sure," she replied. "I wasn't speeding, was I?" The officer glanced at her, and then at his radar gun, which he held in his hand, slightly pointed toward the car. "You were going about 5 miles over the limit." He said, "It's nothing serious, but I'll need to issue a citation." Lena frowned slightly, feeling a knot of frustration begin to form, but she kept her voice calm. "That's fine," she said, "I understand." The officer handed her the ticket and instructed her to appear in front of Judge Nathaniel Turner at the local courthouse. She took the slip of paper and nodded without a word. The officer walked back to his patrol car and drove off, leaving Lena sitting in her car, holding the ticket. She had no real concern about the fine. It wasn't the amount or the fact that it was a minor violation that bothered her, but the feeling that something in the world had shifted back to an old place, one where she would always be seen as a person defined by something other than her achievements, her success, her passion for writing and telling stories that matter. Lena shook her head and started the car again, wondering what kind of day lay ahead in that courtroom. But for now, she just needed to get home and put it all behind her, at least for a little while. The following week, Lena stood in the crowded courtroom, her nerves more present than she had anticipated. The walls, painted a dull beige, seemed to echo with the stories of hundreds who had passed through before her. She felt oddly out of place among the other defendants, some of whom whispered among themselves, others staring at the floor, clearly anxious about their own cases. The noise of murmuring voices filled the space until the door at the front of the room opened, and in strode Judge Nathaniel Turner, his black robe swaying with each purposeful step. Lena felt the tension rise as the judge took his seat behind the large wooden desk. He was a man of about 50, his sharp features framed by graying hair that suggested a man who had seen more than his fair share of courtroom drama. His eyes scanned the room briefly, as if appraising the collection of faces before him, before he reached for his gavel and brought it down with a sharp crack. Silence fell over the room immediately. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Turner," a bailiff called, and everyone in the room stood, including Lena, her heart beating just a little faster as she took her place among the rest. Judge Turner wasted no time. His voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the space as he began reading off names. Some people shuffled forward nervously, while others stood tall, ready for their day in court. Lena fidgeted with the edges of her jacket, watching as the minutes ticked by, one case after another being dismissed or given the usual fines and sentences. Judge Turner's tone never wavered, impersonal, detached, almost robotic in his delivery. It was clear he had done this countless times before. When her name was finally called, Lena stood up, her palms slightly sweaty. She walked toward the front of the courtroom, her steps deliberate but unsure. As she stood before the judge, she felt all eyes on her, some curious, some indifferent. She cleared her throat and offered a polite but brief greeting. Judge Turner barely glanced at her as he sifted through the paperwork in front of him. Without lifting his eyes, he addressed her with a voice that carried authority and impatience. "Ms. Wallace, speeding violation. You're aware of the charge." Lena nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I wasn't aware I was speeding, but I accept the citation." Judge Turner's gaze finally shifted from the papers to her, his expression unreadable. 5 miles over the limit isn't a minor issue. It's a clear violation of traffic laws. He paused, then flicked his wrist as if her presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I'm fining you $150. You will pay by the end of the month." The words hit Lena like a sudden gust of cold air. She had expected the fine, but the way it was handed down so swiftly, without even a moment of consideration, felt dismissive. He hadn't asked about her circumstances, hadn't shown any recognition of who she was or why she might have been distracted. The judge's voice was firm and final, as if the transaction between them was just that, business. Lena's throat tightened, and for a moment, she almost wanted to speak out, to remind him that she was more than just a person standing in front of him with a citation. She was a writer, an artist, a woman who had spent years using her words to challenge ideas and bring attention to the struggles of marginalized communities. But there was no time for that. The gavel came down again, sealing her fate. She turned on her heel and walked out of the courtroom, her shoulders slightly hunched. The sound of the gavel still echoed in her ears as she made her way through the crowded halls. Her mind raced with the frustration of it all, how quickly her identity had been dismissed, how easily she had become just another defendant in a system that seemed to see her as nothing more than a statistic. Lena's drive home that afternoon was a blur. The familiar streets of her neighborhood seemed to stretch endlessly, but her mind was 1,000 miles away, trapped in the small courtroom where she had just been so carelessly dismissed. As she turned onto the road leading to her apartment, she felt the weight of it all pressing in on her. It wasn't just the fine that bothered her. It was the lack of recognition, the way she had been treated like any other anonymous person with a minor infraction. She had spent years writing stories that sought to expose the complexities of race, class, and identity. And yet, in that courtroom, she had felt completely invisible. Lena pulled into her parking space and sat for a moment in her car, staring out at the rows of cars parked around her. The sunlight had begun to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows on the pavement. She sat in silence, the quiet hum of the city filling the air. She had thought about writing about the encounter, but she couldn't quite find the words. How could she explain the subtle sting of it? The feeling that she had been judged not for who she was, but for the color of her skin. She shook her head. It was too complicated. Too much. Eventually, Lena got out of the car, grabbed her bag, and headed inside. She dropped her keys onto the kitchen counter, kicked off her shoes, and made her way to the small living room. It was a cozy space filled with books, scattered manuscripts, and framed photos of friends and family. The room, like the rest of the apartment, was a reflection of her. Comfortable, lived in, filled with the things that mattered. But tonight, it felt empty. Sitting down on the couch, Lena grabbed her phone and started scrolling through social media. She needed some distraction. But as her thumb swiped through endless posts and updates, her mind kept returning to the courtroom. The way the judge had barely looked at her. The way he had handed down the fine without any real thought or care. It was just another day in a system that had long overlooked the people who needed it most. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where a stack of her books sat neatly arranged on a shelf. She had never thought of herself as someone special, but the world had recognized her writing. Her National Book Award had brought her a level of recognition that had opened doors to countless opportunities. Yet none of that had mattered in that courtroom. To the judge, she had been just another person in a long line of defendants. Lena put down her phone and leaned back on the couch, closing her eyes. She let herself think for a moment about how far she had come, about the stories she had told, the readers who had connected with her work, the voices she had helped amplify. She had worked so hard to build something meaningful, something that would last. But all of it had been dismissed in an instant. In the eyes of the law and the eyes of Judge Turner, she was just another defendant, nothing more than the charge on the piece of paper in front of him. The anger simmered beneath the surface, but Lena knew there was little she could do about it at the moment. It wasn't about the fine. It was about the larger question of recognition and how easy it was for someone like her to slip through the cracks, to be overlooked and underestimated. She had spent years fighting for the stories of people who had been silenced by the world. But now she realized it was her story that needed to be told. The thought stayed with her long after the sun had set. Tomorrow, she would find a way to turn this moment into something meaningful. She would write about it, not just the fine, but everything that had led her to this point. Everything that had led so many others to be dismissed, ignored, and erased from the systems that were supposed to serve them. But for now, she closed her eyes, the quiet hum of the world outside lulling her into a restless sleep. The next few days felt like an endless cycle of restless thoughts and growing frustration. Lena couldn't shake the feeling of being underestimated, overlooked. She tried to bury the experience of the courtroom beneath her work, but every time she sat down to write or read, it crept back into her mind. She began replaying the scene over and over, the judge's detached tone, his dismissive attitude, and how she had been treated like just another person caught in the gears of a system that didn't care to see her for who she really was. Lena had known that the world often failed to recognize Black women for the depth of their achievements, but it hadn't truly hit her until now. The court had offered no respect for her accomplishments, no acknowledgement of her role in shaping conversations on race and identity. It was as if her success didn't matter, as if the years of hard work and writing that had earned her the ** National Book Award * meant nothing in the face of a minor traffic violation. She felt as though her identity had been reduced to a mere criminal, a faceless name and number in a system that didn't care to look any deeper. It wasn't until one afternoon, while Lena was scrolling through social media in an attempt to distract herself, that a local journalist post caught her attention. The headline read, * Local woman fined in court, later revealed to be National Book Award winner *. Lena's stomach dropped as she clicked the link, her heart racing as the article began to unfold. The writer had somehow pieced together the details of her encounter in the courtroom, and with a mixture of curiosity and investigative skills, had uncovered the truth about Lena's identity. The journalist, a young woman named **, Sophia **, detailed the encounter in the courthouse, describing how the judge had fine-tuned his decision without a second thought, unaware that he was passing judgment on someone with a notable place in the literary world. The article went on to highlight Lena's career as an author, weaving in the recognition she had received for her work and the impact it had on the broader conversation about race, identity, and injustice. Sophia's writing was careful and respectful, but it was clear. The article was drawing attention to the disparity between the way Lena was treated and the person she truly was. The piece was published that evening, and within hours it had gone viral. Comments flooded in from readers who were shocked to learn that the woman they had known only as a defendant was actually the author of one of the most important books on racial justice in recent years. The article was shared across social media platforms, where users expressed their outrage at how Lena had been treated. Some called it a failure of the justice system. Others condemned Judge Turner for not recognizing the woman in front of him. Lena sat back in her chair, reading the endless notifications and messages of support. She felt an odd mix of validation and discomfort. Part of her was grateful that the truth was finally out there, but another part felt exposed, as if her personal injustice had become public fodder for the masses. Sophia reached out to Lena a few days later, asking if she would be willing to share her side of the story. Lena hesitated but knew she had to speak out. She couldn't let this moment go unnoticed, not when it could spark something bigger. She agreed to meet Sophia for an interview. In that moment, Lena knew she had an opportunity to not only defend herself, but to amplify the voices of others who had been unfairly treated, dismissed, or erased by a system that too often overlooked them. The conversation with Sofia would be the first step toward a much larger story, one that would force people to confront their assumptions about who mattered and why. As Lena sat down for the interview with Sofia, she could feel the weight of the conversation ahead. She hadn't expected the attention the article had garnered, but now it seemed to be spiraling, taking on a life of its own. It was both empowering and uncomfortable. She had always prided herself on her work speaking for itself, but now she was thrust into the spotlight in a way that felt personal, raw, and public. Yet, as the interview progressed, she began to realize the power of her voice in this moment. She wasn't just telling her story, she was speaking for the countless others who had faced the same kind of erasure, the same kind of invisibility. Sofia, sensing the gravity of the moment, asked the question that had been on everyone's mind since the article had been published. How does it feel to have your accomplishments overlooked like that, especially by someone who holds such authority? Lena took a deep breath, the frustration she had been carrying for days beginning to surface. She thought of the judge's cold demeanor, his indifference to her presence. "It's disheartening," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Not just because of the fine. It's not even about the money. It's about the way I was treated, like a nameless person, like my life and work didn't matter. I've spent my career advocating for people whose voices aren't heard, whose stories are ignored. But when it's you, when it's me, standing there, I felt invisible. It's a reminder of how easily someone like me can be dismissed." Sofia nodded, her pen moving swiftly across her notebook. "You're an award-winning author," she said softly, "one of the most influential voices in contemporary literature. But in that courtroom, none of that mattered." "No," Lena replied, the sting of it still fresh. "None of it mattered. To him, I was just another name on a list." She paused, her eyes clouding with the weight of her words. "And that's the thing. This happens all the time. People are judged based on assumptions, based on the way they look, where they come from, who they are. It doesn't matter how hard you work, how much you achieve. The system doesn't always see you. Or worse, it sees the wrong thing." The interview continued, and Lena found herself speaking with more passion than she had intended. She talked about the years of writing, the rejection she'd faced early on, the endless revisions of her manuscripts. She spoke about how she had fought for her place in a world that constantly tried to push her aside, how every story she wrote was a rebellion against the idea that Black women could only exist in limited, stereotyped roles. Sofia, moved by the depth of Lena's words, stopped writing for a moment and looked up at her. "What do you hope comes from this?" she asked. Lena took a moment to think. She wasn't sure where this was all headed, but she knew she had to keep pushing, keep speaking out. "I hope it makes people think. I hope it makes them stop and question how we see each other. Not just Black women, but anyone who has ever been overlooked or misunderstood. We have to do better. We have to see each other fully. If something as simple as recognizing a person for who they are, beyond a citation or a stereotype, can make a difference, then that's a start." By the time the interview was over, Lena felt a strange sense of release. Speaking her truth had been cathartic, but it had also fueled something else inside of her. The article had already sparked a conversation, but now she was ready to take it further. She would use her platform, her voice, to ensure that her experience wasn't just an isolated story, but part of a larger narrative, one that could make real change. Back at her apartment, she sat down at her desk and began to write. The words flowed more easily now, each sentence a reaffirmation of everything she had been fighting for. This was no longer just about her ticket, her fine, or her frustration. It was about something bigger. It was about justice, about recognition, about giving a voice to the stories that had long been silenced. The following weeks saw a surge in public attention that Lena hadn't anticipated. What began as a local news story quickly snowballed into national headlines. Her experience in the courtroom, one that had started as a personal frustration, became a symbol of something much larger. The conversation she had sparked with her interview reached far beyond her circle of readers. Social media exploded with discussions on systemic inequality and how institutions often fail to recognize the humanity of those they are meant to serve. For Lena, the flood of messages, both supportive and critical, was overwhelming. She had always preferred to remain in the background, letting her work speak for itself. But now her personal story was at the forefront of the national conversation, and she couldn't escape the spotlight. Some of the reactions were uplifting, others were filled with venomous critiques. She read the comments, often finding herself shaking her head at the ignorance of some. But what kept her going was the steady stream of people who thanked her for sharing her truth, who told her that they too had experienced something similar, had felt the same sting of being unseen. One evening, as she sat at her desk, scrolling through yet another article that had been written about her case, Lena's phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend, Marcus a fellow writer who had always supported her career. His message was brief but sincere. I'm proud of you. You're making a real difference, Lena stared at the message for a moment, taking in the weight of his words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. Her mind had been so caught up in the whirlwind of media attention, in the weight of representing something much larger than herself, that she hadn't taken a moment to acknowledge the power of what she had done. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for countless others who had been silenced by a system that too often overlooked them. The days that followed were filled with interviews, speaking engagements, and a growing sense of responsibility. Lena was invited to appear on podcasts, radio shows, and even television interviews where she shared her experience and advocated for change in the justice system. It was strange at first, being thrust into the role of a public figure. She had always been more comfortable in the quiet of her own home, with her books and her thoughts. But the more she spoke, the more she realized how powerful her voice could be. One day, she received an invitation to speak at a national conference on racial justice, a gathering of activists, scholars, and public figures who were all working toward the same goal of dismantling systemic inequality. The invitation came from a renowned activist, Dr. Maya Wilkes, who had been following Lena's story and was eager to have her share her insights. The thought of speaking at such a prestigious event both thrilled and terrified her, but there was no turning back now. Lena spent the next few days preparing for her speech, pouring her thoughts and emotions into words that would resonate with the audience. She wanted to make sure her message was clear. The justice system was broken, and it was time to rebuild it from the ground up. But more than that, she wanted to remind people that the fight for equality was not just about laws and policies. It was about how we see each other, how we truly recognize one another's humanity. The day of the conference arrived, and as Lena took the stage, the weight of the moment settled over her. The audience, a sea of eager faces, looked up at her expectantly. She adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. I am not here today because of a speeding ticket, Lena began, her voice steady. I am here because we are all a part of a system that continues to fail people who look like me, who come from communities like mine. And until we recognize the value in all of us, not just the ones with power or privilege, nothing will change. The room fell silent as she spoke, the energy in the air palpable. Lena knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. She wasn't just a writer anymore. She was a voice for change, and this was the moment to push forward. The months that followed Lena's speech at the national conference were a blur of activity. She had become more than just a writer. She was now an outspoken advocate for systemic change, a role she had never anticipated but had come to embrace with fierce determination. Her words had inspired many, and the media coverage only intensified. She had been invited to speak at rallies, panels, and town halls, discussing not just her personal experience, but the broader implications of racial inequality and the way Black people were often treated by the justice system. Despite the growing attention, Lena stayed grounded. She had always believed in the power of stories, the quiet ways in which personal experiences could shed light on larger truths. But now her own story was part of a larger tapestry of injustice, and she knew it was time to continue the work she had started. She wasn't just telling her own story, she was helping to amplify the voices of countless others who had been silenced by systems that had failed them. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting interview, Lena sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened since the courtroom encounter. She had learned so much about the power of her voice, the reach of her words, and the impact that sharing her truth could have on others. But there was still so much work to be done. Her phone buzzed with a new message, an email this time. It was from Judge Nathaniel Turner ***. She paused for a moment before opening it. The message was brief, polite, and surprisingly respectful. Dear Ms. Wallace, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to reach out personally to offer my apologies for the way you were treated in my courtroom. It was never my intention to dismiss you or your accomplishments. In hindsight, I realize I failed to recognize you as the person you are. And for that, I am truly sorry. While I cannot undo the harm caused, I would like to meet with you in person, should you be willing, to discuss how we might begin addressing the larger issues at play here. If you are open to it, I believe we can have a meaningful conversation about the justice system and how we can make it more equitable for everyone. Best regards, Judge Nathaniel Turner Lena stared at the email for a long time, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she considered her response. Part of her felt a sense of vindication. Judge Turner, after all this time, had acknowledged the mistake, had seen the bigger picture, but another part of her was skeptical. The court system, the very system that had failed her and so many others, was not one that could be fixed by a single apology or a conversation. After a few moments of contemplation, Lena decided to respond. Dear Judge Turner, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your apology, though I believe we both know that this is part of a much larger conversation. The truth is, the justice system, in its current state, often fails people like me, people whose identities are seen through the lens of bias rather than humanity. I would be open to a conversation, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not just about me or my experience. It's about a systemic issue that needs addressing. Let's meet. Let's start this conversation. Lena Wallace Lena hit send and leaned back in her chair, feeling a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. She wasn't sure what would come of this meeting, or whether it would be anything more than a gesture. But she also knew that the conversation needed to happen. She wasn't just advocating for herself. She was advocating for a world where people of all races, genders, and backgrounds could be seen and heard for who they truly were. If this was the beginning of that conversation, then it was a step in the right direction. Lena arrived at the courthouse a week later, her heart heavy with both skepticism and curiosity. She had agreed to meet Judge Turner, but she couldn't help but wonder what, if anything, could come from this encounter. Could one conversation really change anything? Could it challenge the deeply ingrained systems of power and privilege that continued to marginalize people like her? Or was it merely a gesture, another act of performative reconciliation? As she walked into the courthouse, Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was not about personal redemption or an apology for the past. This was about the bigger conversation, about the need to confront the biases that had shaped the justice system and the ways it failed to recognize the humanity of those it was meant to protect. When she entered the small meeting room, Judge Turner was already sitting at a table, his expression earnest and slightly apologetic. He stood as she walked in, extending his hand. "Ms. Wallace," he began, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this is unusual, but I felt I needed to speak with you face to face." Lena shook his hand, offering a polite smile, though her eyes betrayed the wariness she still felt. "I'm here because this is an important conversation," she replied. "But it's not just about me. It's about something much bigger." They both sat down, and the conversation began. "I want to start by saying that I didn't recognize who you were in that courtroom, and I made a terrible mistake," Judge Turner admitted, his tone sincere. "But I also realize that what you've been saying about the justice system, about race, about privilege, it's true. I can't deny it anymore. The system is broken, and I've been part of that system." Lena listened carefully. The judge's words were candid, but she wasn't ready to fully embrace them just yet. "It's not just about your failure to recognize me in that moment, Lena said, her voice firm. It's about the way people like me are routinely overlooked by a system that isn't designed to serve us. It's about assumptions, about the way you saw me that day as just another name on a list, a name that had no weight beyond the charge I was facing. I understand. Judge Turner nodded. And I'm ashamed of that. But it's not enough for me to just recognize the mistake. I need to be part of the change, and that's what I want to discuss with you. What can we do to make the system more equitable, to ensure that people are seen for who they are, not just as the charges they carry? The conversation turned deeper, and Lena found herself speaking not only about the impact of her experience, but also about the need for widespread reform. She spoke about restorative justice practices, about the importance of seeing the whole person, not just the mistakes they may have made. She talked about the ways in which bias, even unconscious bias, shapes decisions every day in courtrooms across the country. Over the course of the next hour, Judge Turner listened intently, asking questions and acknowledging the difficult truths Lena was sharing. It wasn't a perfect meeting. There was no instant solution, no magical fix to a system so deeply rooted in inequality. But Lena left that room feeling something she hadn't expected: hope. Not because the meeting had solved everything, but because it had begun a dialogue that was long overdue. The kind of dialogue that could, if nurtured, lead to real change. As Lena walked back out of the courthouse, she knew this was just the beginning. The work wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like her voice, her story, was being heard, not just by those who agreed with her, but by those in positions of power who were willing to listen, learn, and act. She wasn't just advocating for change anymore. She was helping to create it. And that, she realized, was the true power of storytelling.